Good morning. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. Of course, again, this Ramadan, we are coming to you at Saturday at 9 a.m. in the morning. And of course, we will return to our normal time on Wednesday at 8:30 after the holy month of Ramadan. Well, as last week, we had part one of our series on Palestine. This week, of course, we will be focusing on part two of the series. And what has been happening again this week is more and more attacks have been happening just in and around the Masjid al-Aqsa area in Jerusalem. Now, there have been statements coming out from various organizations that are condemning the attacks. The question is, what is going to be the repercussions with regards to Israel, and when will Israel stop its continuous purging of Palestinians? Well, joining me in the studio via Zoom, of course, it's two gentlemen that were with me last week. Nazim Adams, the Palestine Solidarity Alliance National Coordinator, Arshad Samuddin, the Chairman of the Youth for Al-Quds, and I'd like to introduce Abdullah Khrifat. He's a Palestinian advocate and the General Director of AlMizahn. Brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah so much for joining us. Abdullah, I want to start with you. Welcome to Truth to Power. Abdullah, this is again another testing time for our brothers and sisters in Palestine. Just give us a sort of a synopsis of the work that AlMizahn has been doing and the role now that AlMizahn has to play as the attacks from the IDF continues to ramp up, especially during Ramadan.
Oh, thank you, first of all, for hosting me. And I'm glad that you started with this question in particular, because what we are seeing now in Jerusalem is giving us much more work also for the lawyers there in Palestine to be more on the ground and to be with the guys who have been locked up and imprisoned for, defending basically Masjid al-Aqsa and for standing up for their rights in Jerusalem. So Mizahn in general, what we do is that we basically stand with everyone who is fighting for their rights in Palestine. Our lawyers, we stand in Israeli courts where whenever any Palestinian needs to appear in the Israeli unjust courts. So our lawyers are well trained and well versed in Hebrew, and they know the Israeli law quite well. So we try to represent families of the martyrs, the prisoners. We try to stand against house demolitions, land confiscations, theft of houses, like we see that's happening in Jerusalem and elsewhere in the West Bank in particular. And in cases like this past few days when settlers and Israeli forces attack Palestinians for no reason whatsoever, and then they also arrest us. And when any Palestinian defend himself or herself, then that Palestinian will be arrested, and the Israeli would just get away. There are a few cases that we have, a few big cases that we have been working on, like say, for example, the Dawabsha family, where a group of settlers attacked a house in the West Bank, and they burned the house. A father, a mother, and 18 months a baby were all burned alive, and only one child survived. So we are trying now to, for example, this is just one example. We try to lock up the perpetrators, and to also mark the group that attacked, which is a settler group. They are well organized, the settlers. So we're trying to mark them as terrorist organizations. We know that's a bit difficult, considering, we are dealing with Israel. But alhamdulillah, at least what we managed to do, one of the things is that one of the settlers who committed the crime got 3 life sentences. This is actually a great achievement. Because then this will send other messages to the other settlers that that they are not free to attack Palestinians at any second or any time. So generally, what we are trying to do in Palestine is to stand up for Palestinian human rights wherever they are, whether they are inside of Israel, in the West Bank, or even in Gaza, whether they are prisoners, widows of the martyrs, or children who are being detained for throwing a small stone at a tank that's been demolishing their houses.
Nazim, I want to come to you. Every single Ramadan, it's the same story. It's like the Israelis, the IDF just waits for this month to start these attacks. And then you get the settlers who come and do what they do, as Abdullah is saying. This is just becoming a recurring theme, isn't it?
True for us. This is the effects of a racist state where the privileged Zionist Jews take opportunity to attack Palestinian people. Remember, their objective is to ethnically cleanse all of Palestine from its indigenous inhabitants and take ownership of this as their own. So any Jewish person across the world can get citizenship rights in Palestine at any given time, but Palestinians themselves, whether in 48 or in the occupied territories or in Gaza, they don't have basic human rights. There is a total inequality in terms of way people are governed based on race and ethnicity, religion, and so forth. So because of this, and because of the support that they get from the military state and the superpower like the United States Congress, they can continue to act with impunity. And we know that for the last decade and a half, every Ramadan, the people in Gaza, they expect to be bombed. Whether it's just a kind of recurring theme. People would say, is this a religious conflict? Well, when you only attack people in their religious holy month or continuously attack them, then you want to reduce this to a religious conflict. We know that it is much more than that. So the attack is a very concerted, manipulative attack from the Israelis. And I don't like to distinguish between the Kahanists of Rabbi Kahan and his followers who instigated it. These are Israelis all over the show, whether they are liberal or passive or whatever, they are supporting an Israeli state. The most, horrific thing that we saw this week is a number of Israeli Jews making TikTok videos of how they attack and assault Palestinians in the streets of Palestine and the occupied territories and in Israel, and then sharing this as a laugh on TikTok. And they do this with impunity. Had that been the case in South Africa, obviously would have them in the court straight away because there is justice, there is non-racialism and equality. Today we celebrate Freedom Day in South Africa, and this is significant. And we want that same freedoms for the people of Palestine, for the victims, for the occupied people. In the attack on Jerusalem and the defense of Masjid al-Aqsa, we saw hundreds of people injured and brutally arrested. When I say brutally arrested, the arrests were violent assaults on the individuals, even young women, by well-armed, armored military officers. They're not even police, they are military officers attacking a civilian population. And it's time that we begin to hold Israel accountable, and we work very hard to begin to apply sanctions and boycotts and divestment on this racist state.
Arshad, I want to come to you and picking up on what Nazim is saying, ethnic cleansing. This has been a word that has been used for centuries upon centuries upon centuries by colonial powers to make sure that this happens. You see what is happening, and as Nazim is mentioning, the TikTok videos that are being made, but these settlers or the Zionists making these comments of Arabs must die. This is scary, isn't it?
Definitely very scary. And even though we've been seeing, especially in the Gaza, the attacks in Ramadan over the many recent years, it was much less so the case with Masjid al-Aqsa al-Mubarak. Usually Masjid al-Aqsa enjoyed a little break, a little breather, some sort of semblance of partial normalcy, at least for the people in Jerusalem and in Al-Quds. And even that normalcy, they are taking away. And it seems that they are ramping up their efforts to take over Masjid al-Aqsa the way they did with Masjid al-Ibrahimi in Al-Khalil in Hebron not too long ago, or just as they so these instigations, these beatings, these supposedly right-wing, supposedly extremist elements going out in the streets, these are actually part of a coordinated campaign to provoke the Palestinians and then for them to enact measures against them. Their goal is definitely to take over the masjid in totality. I mean, we see just ludicrous the type of treatment in this Ramadan, preventing the Palestinians from entering with anything to break their fast, but then increasing the number of settlers the incursions in the morning, and then them coming with meals and eating in front of the Palestinians in the daytime in Masjid al-Aqsa al-Mubarak. So it's definitely ramping up their efforts. Also, at a time when the world is in chaos and in crisis all over, they are taking this opportunity. While the world is occupied with its own crises, they are taking the opportunity to ramp up their efforts to take as much land, houses, and rights from the Palestinians. The little bit that is left. The little bit that is left, and it's up to activists and truth-loving and speaking people to stand up. This is our opportunity as the Palestinians are standing up, as the Palestinians are showing the world that after 74 years, that they will not succumb and give up 1 inch of their land. It is time for the freedom-loving people of the world to stand firmly behind them. As long as the Palestinian people show that this is definitely their land, they will not give it up. People like us and all over the world will stand firmly with them and behind them.
No, alhamdulillah. And I was going to say rubbing salt into the wounds, but this is much more worse than it. After the break, we will be continuing our conversation. Stay tuned to Truth to Power. Welcome back to Truth to Power. This is, of course, the final part of our series on Palestine. And I'm still with Nazim Adams, Abdullah Khrifat, and Arshad Samuddin. Abdullah, I want to come to you. Just before we went on air, Brother Nazim was just mentioning some of the organizations that have issued out statements in condemnation of what the Israelis are doing right now. It's one thing to have the condemnation, but it's another to act on it. As somebody from AlMizahn, what is the communication with these organizations in trying to at least push that effort for accountability from those who are creating the attacks, either from the IDF or extremist organizations from Israel?
Yes, definitely. There are many organizations in South Africa and across the world who are paying attention. Solidarity movement internationally is paying attention to what is happening specifically now in Jerusalem and generally in what happens usually in Palestine. What I want to say is that now, definitely when Israel increases its attacks, we need more attention, obviously. The Solidarity movement has been doing a lot of work, but it's not enough. What we want is that we would like more organizations to come out and speak and write to their governments about what's happening, write to their members of parliament about what's happening in Palestine. We would like more media, coverage for what is happening, obviously. We would like more, even I would say, South Africans, since we're speaking in South Africa, to go and visit Palestine when there are any things that's happening, throughout the year. Because the more, people from the international community present on the ground, the more Israel is, careful with how they treat the Palestinians. And I would like also South Africans to go and see for themselves. Speaking about Masjid al-Aqsa, for example, Masjid al-Aqsa doesn't only belong to the Palestinians, it belongs to all Muslims. And the same like the harams in Mecca and Medina, if there was, an army, say from wherever it is around the world, standing outside of the haram, trying to get into the haram, obviously Muslims would want to go and protect it. So I would say that Muslims around the world And South Africans have been actually doing this, but maybe we'd like more of that, more of South Africans to go and visit and support the Palestinians economically when they stay at Palestinian hotels, and support businesses, because that is a big support. We also want them to support organizations like Friends of AlMizahn and AlMizahn, that is doing enormous work on the ground. We do have we face lots of challenges, financial challenges. We face lots of coverage in terms of with the media and with the networks. So there is a lot that organizations can do. Maybe even South Africans, if anyone the organizations listening here, they can push also like the government to speak on an international level, like with the African Union, with the United Nations. If South Africa speaks up, we know the international community has this respect for the South African struggle, for some South African icons. We know that the government has been, making, good connections with Palestinians, but we ask that they do even more, because the struggle in Palestine is not over, and we need to intensify our efforts and solidarity. And there is a lot of work that can be done, and I trust like Brother Nazim and Arshad and many others like themselves have been doing amazing work in South Africa, but we still need a lot more of attention and support, inshallah.
Nazim, just banking on what Brother Abdullah is saying, legislation, right? It's one thing having lip service, but it's another implementing that legislation for it to happen. I know last week you said that you've been writing to the South African government, you've been writing to the NPA, you've been writing to these organizations to say, listen, now is the time for it to happen. But how close are we to achieving that?
The Human Rights Watch report today is titled A Threshold Crossed. And I think as Palestinian activists in South Africa, and most of us come from anti-apartheid activism. I mean, our youth was struggling against apartheid in our own country and making sacrifices. To say that we are disappointed is an understatement. We are absolutely disappointed with our government for failing to do an iota to alleviate the struggle of the Palestinian people or support it tangibly. We have to be begging and pleading for them to make moves when it should come naturally from an ANC liberation government to isolate, boycott, and sanction apartheid Israel. We should have from the very beginning have legislation to say that we do not deal with countries that violate human rights. We don't need a report from Human Rights Watch to push us to say this. People in the liberation movement struggled. They trained. MK trained with the PLO soldiers, with Fatah soldiers in Libya and everywhere else. They know that it is a common struggle. I mean, Nelson Mandela was very clear when he said, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. So I think it's time that we hold our government accountable. There's a lot of things we have to hold them accountable for in our own country, and the injustices and inequality that is being faced, the poverty, the corruption, and so forth. But then here was a very simple, straightforward position that they needed to take. And we need to up our ante in terms of the government and say to this government, enough is enough. A threshold has been crossed. Break all relations with apartheid Israel. Sanction their leaders. Sanction those. Put travel bans on those that violate human rights. And give real, tangible support to the struggle of the Palestinian people on the ground. And in all its entities, not necessarily those with whom they have political relations with, like Fatah and AlMizahn and so forth. We need to begin to put pressure on our government to legislate for human rights in every aspect of their international dealings. That is what we are saying. There is a lot of pressure internationally. We have just been playing lip service as a government. The withdrawal of our ambassador and the downgrading of the embassy, it was after immense pressure from the ground and done reluctantly. We see that too many people within the government, even within the ANC, have made their alliances with the capitalists of the world, and in that case, the Zionists in our country, who still dominate a lot of capital in our country. We I mean, we shouldn't even be allowing companies like Milko to operate and then to get municipalities to do water deals with Israel when we have our own technology and companies that can do it here. But you get sold a line and there's a kickback, so Israel gets to do a water project in Mpumalanga somewhere. So the research is out there, and we're going to have to hold our government accountable for all of this. I am very, very disappointed this Freedom Day reflecting in terms of so many things of what we have got wrong as a liberation government.
Arshad, what Nazeem is saying right there, and I think he hits the nail on the head. We're just scratching the surface. You downgrade the embassy, you pull back your ambassador, but these are not harsh, any sort of harsh punishments for a state that continues daily to have these crimes against humanity. And as Brother Nazeem is saying, you've got a water project where there's so many black-owned companies right here in South Africa that can do the very same work, and yet you're still going overseas and getting companies like Milko to do it. Surely this has to change.
Yeah, it's actually very sad that the Zionist presence and influence in South Africa is only too evident, only too apparent, to the detriment of South Africa's own freedom struggle as we celebrate Freedom Day today. If South Africa respects and cherishes its own freedom struggle and history, and wants to keep its respect amongst the international community, it needs to stand up and act in favor of the oppressed Palestinians and others across the world. South Africa definitely enjoys such a huge respect because of its, as we said, its own liberation struggle. But when it fails to support the basic rights of the Palestinians and takes and allows the Zionists free reign almost in South Africa, that doesn't do much for the cause and for its own cause here, or for the cause of the liberation of Palestine.
Well, we'll be back after this break, and we will be discussing Israel's normalization of ties with certain Arab nations. What does that do in hampering any sort of way for freedom in Palestine? Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I'm continuing my conversation with Nazeem Adams, Abdullah Rifat, and Arshad Samuddin. Abdullah, as an Arab, and as we learned in Madrasa during the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu, it was the unity of the Arab nation that allowed the conquest of the world and allowed the spreading of Islam to happen. We fast forward 1,000 years later, we see that Arab nations, in particular the UAE, Bahrain, amongst other nations, are sort of the normalization of ties with Israel. And when I say normalization, I put it in inverted commas. This was, of course, the project of former President US Donald Trump. They call it the kiss of death sort of a thing. My final departure before I leave the White House is to go ahead and make sure that there's normalization of ties. My question is, how does this, in terms of the support for Palestine, get hampered? Because if these ties are normalized, these nations are obligated to do any sort of business with Israel.
But I would like actually to start with the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad when he says that لا فرق بين عربي ولا عجمي إلا بالتقوى, that there is no difference between an Arab and non-Arab except for the taqwa that they have. And that's why I would say that I'm glad that, alhamdulillah, that Prophet Muhammad already made clear that the Arabs are not the custodians of Islam. Islam is for everyone, you know, and unfortunately we see today that there are many Arabs that try to make a hegemony or like to, privatize Islam, in a way, to say that it only belongs to a certain group, not to to another. And in a way, like, to be honest with you, I see this as a relief in the sense that we as Palestinians, we always say that we stand against injustice, in Palestine, but also all over the world. And in a way, like those governments and dictators who are now standing against us, they only prove that and they're standing with the only colonial state in the Middle East. It only proves that they are themselves are illegitimate, just like the country that they are standing with now. We know that people on the ground, the mass people are with Palestine. There's no doubt in that. And also it shows us that the liberation of Palestine will come from the bottom up. That the people, like what's happening now in Jerusalem, we as people on the ground, the people on the ground are the ones who defeated what is now considered as the strongest military in the Middle East. We forced them to remove, the barriers, the metal barriers that they put in outside of Masjid al-Aqsa and leading to the old city of Jerusalem. But and that is just a small symbol for that the masses can defeat. Inshallah, that's what we want to work for. That we never had our hopes to say in the dictators, because a dictator or an oppressor cannot help or cannot be of any use to an oppressed people, right? So in a way, it also connects us with the people on the ground. People in all of these countries that you mentioned, they themselves are oppressed. So in the books, it keeps us check that we are that we never sold out. And that they sold out, the Palestinians and their own people. In terms of Trump, we know that Trump gave lots of support for Netanyahu and for the dictators in the Arab world, but it's again, as Nazim earlier described it, it's like we are fighting against the capitalists of the world, the people, those who try to control the masses, who try to control the wealth, who steal from us. This is not a new thing. It's throughout history. Africa is still suffering from the oppression and the colonialism of Western powers, and that couldn't have been done without collaboration from within Africa as well. Some leaders, here in South Africa, you had some neighboring countries or some other African countries who were siding with the apartheid regime. You had even internally, you had some, leaders of certain Bantustans, collaborating as well with the apartheid regime. There was some people who even, native people who even served in the apartheid regime's military and security services. And this is, you find this everywhere. But again, Palestine, we never had, thoughts that the liberation will come from the oppressors and those who help oppressing other people, their own people, who kill their own people in many cases and imprison them for no reason. So it, in a way, connects us again to the people on the ground, and it affirms to us that we are not only fighting against, that Israel is just the face of a bigger picture, a bigger system of oppression that's happening in Palestine, in the Middle East, and across the world. So hopefully, inshallah, this message that can get across from Jerusalem, from Palestine, where the youth, they defeated the military that considered as the strongest military in the Middle East. And one of the strongest in the world, and hopefully that maybe the other Arab countries can learn that there's no need to be scared, and that they need to stand up for themselves as well.
Nazim, a lot of people would say that there should be no surprise in this happening, because Donald Trump, this was his aim from the start: try and see the countries that really need that sort of capitalist injection within them, and they would see it in Israel. But as Abdullah is mentioning, are we able to right now say that a lot of these Middle Eastern nations are being held hostage by capitalism, number one, the United States, and of course Israel?
I wouldn't say that they're being held hostage. They have a choice. I want to put it in context of what was happening and what is happening. One is the dictators of the Arab world had a huge scare and fear following the Arab Spring. The brief interlude of the liberation of Egypt, the uprising of ordinary people, the uprising even in Syria, which ignited this against a dictator, made the Arab dictators very fearful of losing power. That was the one context in which they took this decision. So the point is important that the decision to align with Israel and the US is a decision of an elite, a dictatorship of the people, and the people on the ground do not necessarily support this. Their allegiance is with the people of Palestine, because they too are like us, believe in equal rights, freedom, and so forth. Well, the most of them, the majority of the people, I'd like to believe that. The second context is that there is, when you steal, it's insatiable. So the continuous theft of land in the occupied territories to create settler enclaves needed to be satisfied, and they needed more and more. There's a need for more and more, and that's why Netanyahu had announced that the total annexation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank as part of their grand plan, and they needed the security that there wouldn't be any response from any of the Arab states at that point. With this, you also have the increased rise in fascism and racism coming forward across the world. So in this context, we see that there is an alignment of forces of evil, which I would like to call it, maintaining elite dictatorships, maintaining the status quo of racial dominance and power and privilege, and the normalization is actually, for me, it's not the right term. It's a complete sellout. It's a complete atrocity to humanity. They are normalizing with an abnormal state, which means you cannot do that. Israel, in terms of what we anticipate to be a state with equal rights for all of its citizens and all of its population, does not do that. So very much it is an apartheid state, which we also describe as an abnormal state. And this is an alliance of abnormality. But the good thing on there is you're beginning to see the counter to this. And the counter to this is the resistance. So you'll find that in the United States, as people march, as Black Lives Matter, they also march for Palestine. It's the same people, because we understand that the basic human rights are universal. The fight against racism is the fight against Zionism and apartheid. So the fight for justice, equality, and freedom is a common struggle and will unite the forces of good in this battle.
Arshad, what Nazim is saying right there, of course, you've got what is happening in Palestine, the continuous purging. You go to France, the ban on the hijabs, and Emmanuel Macron's right-wing extremist sort of decisions. But then there is the other side of it, and that you have these marches that are happening, the Black Lives Matter, the March for Palestine. The good versus evil, that battle is slowly starting to happen, but you see a lot of youth that are getting involved. That is a good sign, isn't it?
100%. In fact, at the beginning of Ramadan, we celebrated the release of one of the Youth for Al-Quds activists in the Emirates, in the United Arab Emirates, that was imprisoned along with a host of human rights defenders since 2010. For 11 years, a young man was imprisoned, and we celebrated his release. So it comes as no surprise that countries like the UAE and others are normalizing, because they are normalizing their own oppression. They are normalizing their own dictatorships. They are only showing their true colors. And even though this is spelling out for maybe the short term and even the medium term more difficulties for the Palestinian people, which we ask Allah to alleviate very soon. Even though this spells out perhaps some increased difficulty in the short term, we know that all of this eventually will lead to the regime's own end, and the rightful people of those countries will rise up against them, and they will form part of the groups that will assist the Palestinians in their victory. We see Saudi Arabia, for example, a very backhanded role. But Saudi Arabia recently, since 2018, rounded up, incarcerated the leadership of Palestinians that have been living in Saudi Arabia for decades. We're not even talking about its own youth leaders and activists that it rounded up in its last purge of 2017. Some people that we know personally that used to visit South Africa that is now languishing in their jails. So definitely the forces, if we could say the forces of evil, of dictatorships, of oppression are just coming together more and more every day. And similarly, as we see now, the forces of truth and justice-loving people, it's also an opportunity for them to unite. And we need to assist in every way possible to see that we do that in our own country and all over the world.
Right.
And also this normalization, in fact, it's not worth the paper it was written on. It's not worth, no matter what they call it, Abrahamic Accords, or no matter what they call it, more than probably 90% of the people on the ground don't support it, whether it is in the UAE, whether it is in Bahrain, or any of those countries.
I mean, the fact that they're using our father Ibrahim and having an accord on his name just shows the desperation of them right now. After the break, we will be wrapping up this conversation. Will we see freedom of Palestine in our generation, or our children's generation, or their children's generation? Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. This is our final section of a 110-minute marathon of discussing Palestine. What now needs to be done in order for that liberation to happen? I'm going to leave the final question for Abdullah with regards to this. I'm going to go to you, Irshad. At what stage are we at this moment that we can have ourselves closer to that liberation? Some say it's a pipe dream. Some say it may not happen in our lifetime, but are we very close to it happening?
I not only would love to think so, I believe so. I think it is apt at this moment to quote one of the most loved heroes of Palestine, of the recent history, loved all over the world, and that is none other than Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, that was killed in Ramadan on his in his wheelchair, in his car, coming out of the masjid by an Apache or an F-16, and I think it was an F-16 in 2004. His words are so apt today in this regard. He said, "I predict that the liberation of Palestine will start from the year 2027. He said, because the first 40 years, 1947, 1948, the first 40 years was the generation that lost Palestine. He said the second generation, the next 40 years, is building a new generation, and which we saw in terms of the intifadas and the uprisings and then a new generation coming about. And he says that from the third 40 years is what he termed as the generation of liberation. So we are on the cusp of the generation of liberation. It is very, very believable that we could see it in our own lifetimes. Either us or our kids are definitely going to see it. That is the moment we are living in.
Nazim, if what we are taking what the late Sheikh Yassin had said, and may Allah fill his qabr with nur, inshallah.
Ameen.
There is going to be a lot of sacrifice then. There is going to be a lot of, fighting, blood that will be spilled. But surely, if we are inshallah alive by then, our dream is to, as South Africans, as people from the outside, to walk into Masjid al-Aqsa without having the IDF interrogating us. That's a dream, isn't it? But how close are we to achieving it?
As South Africans, we fall into the fallacy of thinking that this peaceful negotiation just happened out of the blue from the goodness of the hearts of the oppressors. It never happened. I mean, we forget that there was lots of bloodshed in KwaZulu-Natal. We were living a civil war throughout the 80s and early 90s. In Angola, the South African Defence Force was defeated heavily at Quarterval. The resistance moved and liberated the then Southwest Africa. So those that hold power and privilege, they will not give it up easily. We are in for a fight, and I think we're seeing that there is traction. So as solidarity activists, there's a lot that we can do, but we're seeing also on the ground, there's talk today of the emergence of a third intifada. The difficulty is that unlike South Africa, which had international traction in terms of being on the right side of history in fighting apartheid and racism, it seems that the Palestinian people are very much isolated internationally and diplomatically. So there is, for me, still a fight to go on. But I will tell you that from my own experience as an activist, youth activist in the 80s, we did not expect that we would be liberated. We said freedom in our lifetime, freedom or death, victory is certain. These were our slogans. But we couldn't pinpoint a date, you know. No one can put a date on that. But what I will say is that, you know, post that, we reflected on it, some of us, and we were looking at Quran, and there's a simple ayat in Surah Al-Rum, and it starts with that. It says, "Ghulibati Rum." Rome, one of the greatest empires on the earth, was destroyed in the wink of an eye. So we hold faith to that, but we also take cognizance that the fact that we can struggle is our freedom. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think you've just put it so eloquently that the struggle equals freedom. And this is where I come to you, Abdullah, because as a Palestinian, I know that you reside in South Africa and you want to go back to a liberated homeland, a homeland where you can wake up one morning and you don't have to worry about IDF jets flying over your house and putting bombs there. As an advocate, as somebody working here, as somebody who has seen what has happened in South Africa during those liberations, you learned from Brother Nazim, who was a youth activist, obviously, during his time in the 80s. How hopeful are you, Brother Abdullah, that this liberation is happening soon and it can happen, inshallah, in our lifetime?
Well, I'm actually very hopeful, and I'm very positive that change will come, inshallah, in Palestine. And as Nazim said, that, you know, you in South Africa, those who were living in the 70s and the 80s, they didn't expect that in a few years you will have freedom and you will be able to, you know, move around South Africa like much easier than before. I would say that, you know, I chose to come to South Africa, though, like before I come in interrogations, I was told, don't go to South Africa, because if you go, you will not come back. We will not allow you to come back and work. I told him, because you said that, I will go to South Africa. And then again, when I finished my studies at UCD and I went back to Palestine, they called me again for interrogations, like they do every year. I go home. Then they again said, we're not gonna let you work in Palestine there. So I chose to come to South Africa so I can work with AlMizahn, that is a Palestinian group working on the ground. We know that from studying different struggle stories, we know that we need at least 3 pillars, which is Nazim touched on the armed resistance of the groups that were fighting in Palestine, in Angola and otherwhere. There are groups like that in Palestine. But what we need to work harder on is the international, pressure and the popular mobilization on the ground. And maybe I will add another one, which is we need to produce new leaders in Palestine. And hopefully, inshallah, yes, Nazim, we need to produce leaders. And I strongly believe that South Africa will have a huge impact on that. The South African people have already beaten like one of the beasts of the of the previous in the previous few decades. That's the apartheid regime, and I believe that we will also do the same, and inshallah we will even learn about the mistakes that South Africans made even post liberation, and we will inshallah defeat. I'm very hopeful, I'm very inspired that we will definitely do that, and I'm not going to wait for my grandchildren only to be liberated. I want to inshallah liberate Palestine in my lifetime, not even my children's lifetime only. Inshallah, myself, my generation will be the generation that Arshad mentioned, that the generation that will make the change. Inshallah, and I promise that we will do everything our hands, everything that we can do. We sacrifice our times with our families. We sacrifice, our comfort to liberate Palestine, and this is not going to be wasted. We will definitely be victorious, and we will beat the Israeli apartheid regime, inshallah.
Ameen, ameen. And inshallah, I continue to make dua that all four of us, inshallah, can enter Palestine, we can have a nice meal, and we do not have to worry about an IDF soldier coming to interrogate us. And we make dua that liberation happens very, very soon. We can visit the third haram in Masjid al-Aqsa, and we don't have to worry about any sort of violence that may occur. Brothers, I'd like to say Jazakallah to you, Abdullah Rifat, Nazim Adams, Arshad Samuddin, for making time, especially Nazim and Arshad, who've given us 2 weeks of their time. And of course, continue your good work at AlMizahn, Abdullah. Your work also, Arshad, for the Youth for Al-Quds. And of course, Nazim, I know you're very, very active with PSA. And inshallah, all three of your organizations can play their role, no matter how major or minor, in making sure the liberation of Palestine is achieved in our lifetime. Jazakallah so much.
Shukran. Thanks for having us.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. No, it's an absolute pleasure. And in wrapping up all of this, I'd like to say, as people in the media, this is the forum that we are allowed to go ahead and make our voices heard. This is the forum that we are given to make sure that we stand up for those who continue to be oppressed. But it's up to government, it's up to civil unions, it's up to different organizations to continue to put their pressure on Israel to end its heavy-handedness and hand back the land to the Palestinians, land that is rightfully theirs, that is theirs from their ancestry. So we continue to make, inshallah, that does happen. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the Truth to Power team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.